The sun was setting over the savannah, painting the tall grass in hues of gold and crimson. Among the fading light, a figure moved with unusual hesitation. It was a lioness, her fur dusty, her body trembling, her steps heavy. Lions are creatures of pride and power, yet this one carried something in her gaze that no one could ignore: desperation. She was not hunting, she was not stalking prey. Her every move seemed weighted with grief, as though she carried a burden too heavy for even her powerful shoulders. In her mouth, she held a small cub, weak and unmoving. Each step she took was deliberate, almost pleading, as if she were seeking something or someone. The villagers who spotted her kept their distance, whispering in fear. A lioness out of her territory was danger enough, but one acting strangely was worse. Yet there was no roar, no aggression, only sorrow. Her golden eyes darted around, searching, until they locked onto a figure standing by the edge of the fields, a man who could not look away. The lioness approached slowly but with determination, her tail low, her body tense. The man's instincts screamed at him to run, to seek shelter. But something in her behavior stopped him. She wasn't here to kill, she was here to beg. In that moment, predator and prey no longer mattered. What stood before him was not a beast, but a mother. And then, as the wind carried the faint cries of the cub, the man realized what was happening. The desperate lioness was not his enemy. She was asking him for the one thing she could not give alone: hope. But what would he do? Lions have long been painted as symbols of power, dominance, and untamed ferocity. They are called the kings and queens of the savannah, feared and respected in equal measure. But every legend has another side, and even the fiercest predator cannot escape the pull of motherhood. A mother's instinct to protect, to fight for her young, can sometimes defy every expectation we have of the wild. This lioness was no exception. Once feared for her strength, she now appeared as a shadow of herself, gaunt, restless, and strangely vulnerable. To the people who watched from a distance, it was unsettling. A lioness should never appear weak, and yet here she was, placing her trust not in her pride, but in something far more unlikely. A man. The man, a simple villager with no training in animal rescue, stood frozen as the great beast approached. Every story he had ever heard told him to run, to hide, to survive. But there was something undeniable in her eyes, a plea so raw, so human, that it pierced through fear itself. This was not predator and prey. This was a mother crying out for help. As the lioness placed her cub before him, the weight of the moment became clear. This was no ordinary encounter. It was not a battle for territory or a test of strength. It was a fragile exchange of trust, offered in silence between two lives that should never have crossed paths this way. What happened next would not only decide the fate of the dying cub, but also create a story that millions would carry in their hearts, a story of courage, compassion, and the unlikeliest bond ever forged in the wild. The sun had barely risen when Daniel set out into the fields. He was no hero, no ranger, just a farmer living at the edge of the savannah. His life was simple, built on soil and seasons, on the rhythm of planting and harvesting. Yet on that morning, as he adjusted the worn strap of his water container and surveyed the endless horizon, he felt the stillness in the air. It was the kind of silence that always carried a warning, a silence heavy with unseen eyes. Daniel had grown up listening to stories of lions. His father told him to fear their power. His mother warned him to never walk too far at dawn or dusk. He knew they were hunters, unpredictable and merciless when cornered. But the figure that emerged from the tall grass that morning was not the lioness he had imagined in childhood nightmares. She was limping, her fur streaked with dust, her head bowed low. Most striking of all was the way she carried her cub, gently, carefully, as if every step was measured against the fragility in her jaws. Daniel froze where he stood, every muscle tense, his instincts screaming for him to run. yet he could not move. The lioness was close enough now for him to see the tremble in her body, the exhaustion in her movements. Her eyes met his, not with fury or hunger, but with something Daniel could never have expected. They held sorrow, fear, and a plea so profound that it made his chest tighten. She lowered her head, setting the cub softly onto the earth. The small body was frail, its breathing shallow, each rise and fall of its chest a struggle against time. Daniel felt his throat tighten as he took in the sight. The cub was dying, and here was its mother, a predator who could tear him apart in a heartbeat, asking him for mercy. This was not the savannah he knew. This was something else, a fragile truce between species that should never trust one another. Around them, the village stirred. A few figures watched from a distance, holding their breath, too afraid to move closer. Whispers carried in the wind, some urging Daniel to step away, others murmuring about omens and curses. But Daniel heard none of it clearly. All he could see was the cub, weak and trembling, and the lioness whose entire being was focused on him. He felt the weight of a choice he had never imagined making, whether to risk everything to help or to turn his back and walk away. As the cub let out a faint cry, Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He knew predators did not beg, and yet here one was, surrendering her pride and her fear in exchange for the smallest chance at saving her child. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching longer than the last. And as Daniel looked from the cub to the lioness, he realized the next step belonged to him. What he chose to do in that moment would decide whether this story ended in tragedy or in a miracle. Daniel's legs trembled as he stood frozen in the dry grass, the weight of the lioness's gaze pressing down on him like a storm. His mind raced with every lesson he had ever learned about survival. Never stare at a lion, never stand still when danger approaches, never ignore the instinct to run. Yet none of those rules seemed to apply now. He wasn't facing a predator in her prime. He was standing before a mother on the edge of despair. Inside, two voices battled fiercely. One screamed at him to retreat, to live another day, to protect himself from becoming the next story whispered around the village fire. The other whispered something unfamiliar, that walking away would be a betrayal not just of the cub, but of the fragile trust the lioness had offered him. He could feel it in her eyes. She was not here to strike, but to surrender, to plead in the only way she knew how. For a brief, dizzying moment, Daniel wondered if the weight of the world now rested on him alone. The cub let out a weak, rasping cry, pulling Daniel's focus downward. Its tiny chest heaved as if each breath was borrowed, as if every moment was a battle it was slowly losing. The sight struck him with a force he could not shake. He had seen hardship before, animals suffering from drought, children weakened by hunger, but never had he seen a bond so raw as that between this lioness and her dying cub. Her golden eyes never left him, glistening in the light, filled with the same emotion he might see in any grieving parent. Daniel took a slow step forward, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it might echo across the fields. The lioness's muscles tensed, her ears flat, her breath quick and sharp. For an instant, he thought she might pounce, end the fragile truce in a flash of claws and teeth. But she didn't. She simply stayed where she was, body trembling, waiting. It was as though she understood that the risk went both ways, that in this exchange of courage, she had to hold her ground just as much as he did. From a distance, the villagers began to shout. Some begged him to stop, warning him of certain death if he drew any closer. Others urged him forward, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding, something that might change the way they looked at the wild forever. But Daniel blocked out their voices. He felt a strange calm take hold, as if his fear had been replaced by purpose. Each step he took seemed to carry the weight of history, of a story that would outlive him, if only he dared to see it through. By the time he stood just a few feet away, Daniel could see every detail: the cub's frail body twitching in the dust, the lioness's ragged breath, her sides rising and falling with exhaustion. He reached out a shaking hand, unsure if he was about to seal his fate or save a life. The lioness did not move. The moment hung suspended in silence, every eye watching, every heart waiting. And then the cub whimpered again, weaker this time, forcing Daniel into a choice he could no longer avoid. Daniel lowered himself slowly, knees pressing into the dry soil, his trembling hands stretching toward the fragile cub. Every instinct told him this was madness. Reaching for the child of a predator was not an act of courage, but of recklessness. And yet, in that fragile moment, it didn't feel reckless. It felt necessary. The cub's body rose and fell in shallow breaths, each weaker than the last, and Daniel knew there might not be much time left. The lioness tensed, her muscles rippling beneath, her dusty fur. Her golden eyes burned into him, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. Daniel expected her to lunge, to reclaim what was hers, to remind him of the raw line that divided man from beast. But she didn't. Instead, she shifted slightly, lowering her head closer to the earth as if to say, "Do what I cannot." It was not a gesture of surrender, but of impossible trust. Daniel felt his heart hammer against his ribs as he realized that this mother, fierce and wild, was entrusting him with the most precious piece of her soul. His fingers brushed against the cub's fur, coarse at first, then soft, fragile, trembling under his touch. The tiny creature whimpered, a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the rustling of the grass. Gently, Daniel scooped the cub into his arms, lifting it against his chest. The warmth of its body was fading, its weight alarmingly light. He cradled it carefully, as if one wrong move could shatter what little life still lingered within. Around him, the villagers gasped. Some clutched their mouths in disbelief, others crossed themselves as though witnessing a miracle or a curse. The air was thick with tension, and still the lioness did not attack. She stood rigid, watching every motion, her tail twitching, her breath sharp. The bond between predator and human had become a razor's edge, fragile, unthinkable, and yet undeniably real. Daniel felt the pressure of 1,000 unseen eyes, not just the villagers, but the world itself, waiting to see how this story would end. The cub stirred faintly in his arms, its tiny head lifting just enough for Daniel to glimpse its glazed eyes. He could hear its faint rasp, the sound of a battle it was losing second by second. He pressed it gently to his chest, murmuring words he did not even recognize as his own, whispers of comfort meant to soothe himself as much as the dying creature. The lioness let out a low rumble, not of threat, but of urgency, a sound that demanded he move, that he do something before it was too late. Daniel rose to his feet, the cub cradled tightly against him. His eyes flicked to the horizon, to the village huts beyond, to the faint promise of safety that seemed both near and impossibly far. He knew the cub could not survive long without help. He also knew every step he took with this fragile life in his arms could trigger the lioness to reclaim her child with deadly force. Yet as he looked back into her eyes, he saw no hunger, no rage, only desperation. It was clear their fates were now bound together. The next step would decide whether this fragile act of trust ended in salvation or in tragedy. I started to run without thinking. The cub pressed against my chest, its warmth so faint I feared I was holding a fading ember. Every step jarred my knees and rattled my breath, but I didn't dare slow down. I could feel the lioness behind me, hear the pad of her paws through the grass, the steady rhythm of a guardian refusing to fall behind. The villagers' huts glimmered like a promise at the edge of the fields, but they looked impossibly far away. I shouted toward them, not sure if my voice carried, "Water, clean cloth, hurry!" The wind stole half my words, but panic lent me strength. The heat rose off the ground in shimmering waves, and the air felt too thin to breathe. Each inhalation felt like swallowing gravel. Behind me came a low sound, half growl, half plea, and I knew it was the lioness urging speed without understanding the human word for it. I didn't have to look back to know her eyes were fixed on me, not with hatred, but with a terrible hope. The cub let out a tiny gasp that barely reached my ears. I drew it tighter to me, feeling the slight rattling breath against my forearm. "Stay with me," I murmured, the plea spilling out before I could stop it. I had spoken to animals before, but never like this. Never as if words could build a bridge across the wild. When we reached the dusty edge of the village, people scattered, some in fear, some in awe. The lioness slowed, but did not stop, her presence a moving wall that made every onlooker hesitate. "Clear a space," I called, and a few brave hands obeyed, pushing aside baskets, pulling a table into the shade of an acacia. Someone thrust a clay bowl of clean water toward me. Another brought a roll of linen and a small jar of herbal salve. I laid the cub down as gently as I could, its limp paw sliding against my wrist. The lioness stood just beyond the line of shadow, head low, chest heaving. Her restraint terrified me more than any snarl could have. There was intelligence in it, and a pain I could feel like a heat across my skin. I dipped the cloth and dabbed the cub's nose and gums, moistening its mouth with drops of water, counting between each touch to keep the breathing steady. Up close, I saw the crusted milk on its whiskers, the dust in its fur, the faint bruise at the side of its ribs. Not a bite, no tearing or puncture, more like a hard blow or a fall. I cleaned the eye corners, lifted the chin, kept the airway open the way I had seen once when our village healer worked on a child after a sandstorm. "Slow breaths," I told myself. "Don't rush." The cub twitched, a fragile tremor, then went still again. A woman beside me whispered a prayer. A boy tried to edge closer, and the lioness took one step forward that froze him like stone. "It's all right," I said to him. "We're helping." But I don't know if I was reassuring the boy or pleading with fate. Minutes stretched thin. I rubbed the cub's chest with the backs of my fingers to warm it, wrapped its body in the linen, leaving room for its breath to rise. The lioness lowered herself to the ground, forepaws extended as if kneeling before a shrine she didn't understand. The sight undid me. I spoke in a steady voice I barely recognized. "Listen, little one. Your mother brought you to us. She trusted me. You're not alone." Someone placed a small bowl of goat's milk at my elbow. I shook my head. Too risky, too soon, but soaked the cloth and let a single drop touch the cub's tongue. It shivered, then swallowed. The tiniest movement known to man, and a wave of relief hit me so hard I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from crying out. A breeze stirred the acacia leaves, and the world seemed to narrow to the rhythm of a chest, rising, falling, stalling, then rising again. The cub's breaths came a fraction deeper, not enough, not safe, but something. I glanced at the lioness, her ears angled forward, eyes bright with a ferocity I had seen only in battle and in mothers watching their sleeping children. "We need more time," I whispered, unsure whether I spoke to her, to the villagers, or to the sky itself. The sun inched higher, and with it the risk, heat, dehydration, the 1,000 quiet enemies that strike the weak. I pressed another drop to the cub's tongue. One swallow. Two. The chest rose, paused, rose again. For one blazing second, I believed we had turned the tide. I felt the villagers lean in, as if hope were a physical thing that might catch, might spread from hand to hand. And then, as though the world had remembered its cruelty, the cub's breathing hitched and faltered. The tiny body slackened. The swallow did not come. I rubbed the sternum, counted, waited. Too long. The lioness rose to her feet with a sound like a heart breaking, low and ragged. She took a step toward the table, and every soul in the village held its breath. I looked down at the cub, then up at the mother who had staked everything on a human. I had one last choice to make, one last thing to try before the light in those small eyes slipped away. For a long time, I didn't dare blink. Every shallow rise of the cub's chest felt like a miracle borrowed from the edge of death. Its breathing was uneven, fragile, but slowly, painfully slowly, it began to steady. The cloth damp with water against its lips seemed to help, each swallow sparking a spark of life where there had been only silence. Around me, the villagers whispered prayers, their fear of the lioness momentarily eclipsed by the wonder of seeing a dying cub cling to survival. The lioness remained crouched at the edge of the circle, her massive frame tense, her golden eyes locked on every movement of my hands. I felt her presence like a shadow at my back, both comforting and terrifying. She did not growl, she did not charge. She simply waited. And in that waiting, in her restraint, there was something deeper than instinct. It was patience, born of desperation. The kind of patience that comes only when hope is slipping away. She seemed to know that the cub's fragile breaths were no longer hers to protect alone. The cub stirred again, this time with more strength. Its paw twitched against the linen, claws barely scraping the fabric. A weak mewl escaped its throat, and the sound pierced through the hush of the villagers like a blade of sunlight through storm clouds. Gasps erupted around me, and even I couldn't stop the swell of relief that surged through my chest. I looked up to see tears shimmering in the eyes of an elder, and for the first time I realized that this story had already become larger than me. It was no longer just about a man and a lioness. It was about every soul who witnessed the impossible unfolding in our village that day. As the cub's breathing deepened, I loosened the cloth slightly, cradling it so that the fresh air could reach its small lungs. The tiny creature blinked, eyes cloudy but alive, and its fragile chest rose with something that felt closer to rhythm. I dared to lift it, slowly, carefully, until I stood again, with the cub, pressed against me. The lioness rose too, her entire body vibrating with urgency. Every villager stepped back, the air trembling with the unspoken question. Would she reclaim her cub now with claws and teeth, or would she honor the trust she had given? I took one step forward. The lioness mirrored me, closing the distance with deliberate slowness. The cub whimpered softly, and I felt its heartbeat faint but steady against my palm. I knelt on the earth and lowered the cub to the ground, letting it rest on the dust between us. The lioness's eyes never left mine as she crept closer, one paw at a time, her body taut as a drawn bow. Then, with a tenderness that defied every story told about her kind, she leaned down and lifted her cub into her jaws once more, gently, reverently, as if she had been waiting all her life for this single moment. When she rose again, the cub safe in her mouth, the lioness turned her head and met my gaze one last time. In her golden eyes was no hunger, no threat, only recognition. A silent acknowledgement that we had crossed a boundary neither of us was meant to cross, and in doing so had forged something unforgettable. She gave a low, resonant sound, half growl, half sigh, and with that she melted back into the tall grass, her cub nestled against her teeth alive. The villagers erupted in cries of awe, some falling to their knees, others clapping their hands to the sky. As for me, I could only stand in stunned silence, the weight of what had just transpired settling into my bones. That evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon, the village felt different. The air carried a hush, as though the earth itself was holding on to the memory of what had unfolded. We had witnessed not just a rescue, but a moment that shattered the boundaries between man and beast, predator and protector. A desperate lioness had humbled herself to seek help from the very species she should fear most, and in doing so, she revealed the universal truth that binds us all. Love knows no borders. The image of her golden eyes will never leave me. They were not the eyes of a predator in that moment, but of a mother, fierce, vulnerable, and profoundly human in her desperation. She reminded us that courage is not always found in strength, but in the willingness to trust. The cub's fragile breath, saved by that unlikely bond, became a testament to what can happen when compassion outweighs fear. It was a story not just of survival, but of faith in the unthinkable. Faith that even in the wildest places, kindness can change destiny. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder of the miracles hidden in the most unexpected corners of life. Share it with someone who needs hope today. And if you want to continue witnessing powerful stories of animals, survival, and the unbreakable bonds that unite us, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and comment hope below to show you believe in miracles. Together, we can spread a message the world so desperately needs.